Hello, everybody. Welcome to SALT Talks. This is unfortunately in lieu of the SALT conference. We're trying to have a few times a week some very interesting discussions about what's going on in the world and some real meaty topical investment topics as well. I am in lieu of John Darcy today. You can see there's no duck here, and the rumor is that John Darcy's mother-in-law threw that duck in the garbage. So you won't be seeing that duck anytime soon. But this is Anthony Scaramucci, and today's SALT Talk is about cannabis. And so the title is Essential Cannabis. It is a panel brought to you by one of our SALT partners, ETFMG. The stock symbol is MJ. We've been a big supporter of the cannabis space over the years. Just given our libertarian philosophy, we sort of feel like particularly for medical uses and obviously recreational, but medical uses, this is going to be an explosively growing industry. I'm going to turn it over to these guys in a second, but ETFMG is the leading thematic ETF issuer. It's known for innovative investment products like MJ, the world's largest cannabis ETF, and most recently GERM or GERM, the first way to invest directly in vaccines, treatments, and testing in biotech. So hosting today's panel is ETFMG MJ's research and banking expert, Jason Wilson. Jason is a Toronto native. He's a Canadian Forces veteran with over 15 years of asset management experience in finance, structured products, and he has a great track record in bringing hard-to-access asset classes to the market. He's been working in connection with the legal cannabis industry for the past decade and is a great host for what I think will be a phenomenal panel. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason. Good luck to you guys, and we're fascinated by the upcoming discussion.
Great, Anthony. Thanks very much for the intro. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of SALT Talks. And to our audience today, welcome to Cannabis Aisle. It's a bipartisan discussion we're going to have on cannabis, which is right now the world's largest emerging industry. So we have three great guest speakers joining us today to discuss the growth of the cannabis industry and the effect it will have on U.S. jobs, tax revenue, and the upcoming election. Top of the lineup is David Culver, who currently serves as Vice President of Government and Stakeholder Relations at Canopy Growth. David has about 20 years of federal experience and currently manages all day-to-day state and federal engagement at Canopy Growth US. So very busy job on his part. Patrick Martin of Cozen will also be joining us today. Patrick's a principal at Cozen, where he directs the firm's government relations and public advocacy efforts in the Midwest. He's also a key member of the firm's government relations team in Washington, D.C. Last but definitely not least, we have Eric Huey. But Eric is president of Platinum Advisors. He has over 25 years of experience as a senior government relations and public affairs executive. He's repeatedly been on the Hills list, top lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So thank you, speakers, for joining us. And I think it's going to be a great little conversation we have today. So I guess to kick things off, let's get right into it. Let's talk about cannabis and COVID. When we look at what happened back in March, obviously numerous states started issuing stay-at-home orders and impaired the cannabis-related businesses, along with most other consumer-faced businesses, were being forced to shut down. And we kind of had a 180. Immediately, it didn't take long, where most of the states that legalized cannabis decided that they were essential businesses and allowed them to reopen. Patrick, can you tell us a little bit? I know you work with a bunch of multi-state operators. Can you tell us what was happening behind the scenes that saw that reversal?
Sure, absolutely. And Jason, thank you so much for having us. COVID really brought the cannabis industry front and center in terms of how states were both responding to the crisis and also how states were making determinations about what businesses were essential and what businesses were non-essential. And what we saw is overwhelmingly across the country in almost 30 states, that cannabis programs, both medical and adult use, were deemed essential. I'm speaking to you all from Illinois. We have a young but very successful adult use program here that was passed in historic fashion by our state legislature last year. And what we saw was the governor and his team and folks in our state legislature saying that we need this program to go forward, and that it needs to be treated just like grocery stores and liquor stores and other forms of retail that in the midst of an economic crisis are going to provide real benefit to these communities. And just in the month of May, the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation has told us that there was $77 million in sales here in Illinois combined for our medical program and our adult use program as well. So extraordinary economic benefit to the state. And so you saw a lot of governors say very clearly to their states that this needs to be deemed essential. And I think it really showed progress for the industry and for how cannabis is being viewed across the country as an essential part of our economy.
Awesome. So, it always seems to me that quite the disconnect between, you got the majority of the U.S. population lives in states that's not only legalized cannabis, but it says essential. And yet, we have a handful of states that aren't quite there yet. Let's not even talk about the federal level yet. So what's going to happen later this year? I mean, do you see a number of states kind of moving forward to legalize, maybe later this year, maybe early 2021? Maybe Patrick, Eric, you can both chip in on this.
Yeah, I think you're going to see states that don't have an adult use program, but maybe have a medical program, take a look and kind of assess the political environment. And I think likewise, states that have neither are going to take a look at doing something maybe in the medical space for the first time. The other thing in response to COVID that I didn't mention earlier is just the disconnect between the action that the states took in deeming cannabis an essential industry and the federal government providing no relief in any of the packages that were signed into law, particularly the CARES Act. Cannabis businesses aren't able to benefit from any of those small business programs because of the federal illegality. And so once again, as we've seen through many issues over the course of our history, states are leading and the federal government just isn't quite there yet, but we think the momentum is certainly in our direction.
And you found, Jason, first of all, thank you. Thanks to Salt Talks and ETFMG and to Anthony Scaramucci and to you, Jason, for having us. There's this weird dichotomy where these are essential facilities, but yet they're not legal in so many states. You've got 34 states that are where it's legal. You have for medical. You have 11 states plus Washington D.C. where it's legal for recreational. It's going to be on the ballot in states like New Jersey and South Dakota. It could very well be on the ballot in 4 or 5 more all over the West and upper Midwest. And governors are now desperate for revenues. And due to the COVID crisis, you're looking at the state of California has a $64 billion deficit. New York's going to have a $13 billion deficit. It's going to need $61 billion in federal funds to make up for it. So you can see the pressure that's mounting on, say, Governor Cuomo in New York, where legislators have penned a letter and said, we've got to do this. We've got to legalize. The governor of New Mexico, Lujan Grisham, said her biggest regret since she became governor is that she did not legalize prior to COVID, because they would have brought in $100 million in revenue, and that's critically needed at this time. So I think by the end of the year, Pennsylvania, of course, is looking at this. I think it could very well move in Pennsylvania because there's both Republican and Democratic agreement that this has to move. For moral reasons due to social justice. It has to move for budgetary and fiscal reasons, and it has to move because that's where the will of the people are. 66% of Americans believe that cannabis should be legal, and that's a majority of Republicans from baby boomers on down to millennials. So, and the Democrat numbers are way off the charts. So the public is there. This is inevitable. It just sometimes takes a while for some state leaders and for federal leaders to get there, but something has to be done, and we're gonna see movement on this. The momentum is just too great.
So David, switching over to you for a second, because you actually are working at Canopy Growth down in the U.S. Obviously, it's kind of the bellwether for the industry. Just looking at the numbers in the U.S., 250,000 jobs created in the legal cannabis industry. We've seen 15% kind of year-over-year growth in jobs. We're just talking about state revenues. Obviously, look at Colorado alone has generated over $1 billion in tax revenue since legalizing in 2014. What is, and Eric was touching on it, but David, I'd love to hear your view too. What does this, what are municipalities going to do, states? Is this going to be the big driver really for legalizing? Is the fill all the holes that the pandemic has created?
Yeah, I think it's going to, and I think Patrick and Eric alluded quite nicely to this. And let me also, just speaking for the first time, express my thanks to you, Jason, and also to Salt Talks. I very much wish we were sitting in Las Vegas doing this like the rest of us, but hopefully we will be able to do that soon. So I think Patrick and Eric hit on a lot of the main points associated with your question, but what I want to just mention that I think is also of importance is the fact that we are going to start a recovery nationwide once we get this virus under control, and we're going to get it under control, and the economy is going to recover. I think cannabis can be an enormous shot in the arm as we begin that process. The last estimates that I saw really put the job numbers at about 1.5 billion if we were to 1.5 million if we were to legalize in the U.S. And I can't help think about the end of prohibition, having spent so much time in the alcohol industry, because the parallels that we are in now related to unemployment and also related to the need to jumpstart the economy at some point soon are staggering. So opening the market is going to be really critical, I feel. I know that we are investing in that regard as a company, but it's also worth mentioning that we're going to have great products here in the United States. And if we legalize, it's going to really help other countries around the world to do so as well. We're going to be a leading force there, and we can really add on to the export potential that we've got through cannabis. I believe strongly in that. And then the third prong of it is innovation. I know lots and lots of companies have exciting products coming to market. We have our Martha Stewart line that we've talked about quite a bit that's coming out in the fall. And we also have our drinks that'll be coming into the US through the Acreage channels later this year. And these are exciting, innovative products. They have no impact on the liver, they have no calories, and they have no hangover. And I think a lot of the country is interested in trying cannabis, but they're not going to go the smoking route. And so innovative products like beverages can really drive that economic recovery in the space. So I'm excited about the future. And I think that we can be a really important part of the recovery when the nation starts that process.
And I completely agree. It's going to be fantastic to see how this all plays out. Obviously, it explains a lot of the investment in the space that's happening right now. We've heard a lot about COVID and how it's affected the cannabis industry and obviously the whole economy, and we'll see how all that plays out. Hopefully, we get back to normal much sooner rather than later. But the other big issue that we've been grappling with, obviously, it's been not addressed properly for generations, and continues to particularly during this pandemic, really rear its ugly head. And that's the amount of racism that's out there, the social injustice, the police brutality. And a lot of this ties in with the cannabis industry. Patrick, you represent and work with a number of the MSOs in the U.S. What's your take on this? How are the multi-state operators, cannabis businesses in the U.S., how are they addressing the social justice issues going forward?
Jason, it's a terrific question, and it's of the utmost importance to all of us here. I think what's happened in the last several weeks has caused all of us to really take a step back. And, there's been conversations around social and restorative and reparative justice in the cannabis industry that have been taking place for a long time. But if you really think about everything that's happened in the last few weeks, Jason, Eric, David, and myself, none of us know what it's like to be arrested or pulled over or targeted because of the color of our skin, and have be arrested for possession of cannabis, as a way to be sort of unfairly targeted. None of us know what that's like. And the protests that have taken place over the last several weeks, I think, have caused all of us to really do a lot more listening about what the world is like for so many out there. And cannabis has a unique role to play in not only how do we right the wrongs of the past, when we're talking about things like expunging records, we're talking about things like making sure that cannabis is decriminalized, but what are we doing in terms of looking forward? How are we giving people that have been unfairly targeted and unfairly arrested and prosecuted, how are we giving them opportunities in this new cannabis economy? I think that's what the companies that I work with spend a lot of time talking about. And you've seen states take a leadership role in this as well. And I think you'll see large states that look to do adult use programs through their state legislatures look at the model that was set up here in Illinois, which was really the first state to address social equity and social justice in their cannabis law in a really direct way. And it's things like giving people opportunity who are from areas of high unemployment and high poverty and areas that have high arrests and conviction rates on cannabis. In Illinois, we set up a social equity fund, which is financed by current license holders and will be financed by future license holders. And it's through things like loan repayments and license transfers. And then it's companies looking at who they employ and who sits on their boards. And you're already seeing cannabis companies take a second look at who are we employing and who do we have in the C-suite and in the boardroom, and does that reflect the diversity of this country? So I think it's a conversation that is going to continue to take place. I know that David and Eric and I talk about it all the time. But this moment in time, what we've all been experiencing and living through, I think has really put a fine point on how important this issue is.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It is an incredibly important issue. And it's great to hear of the measures that are being taken to address this. David, if I can, I'd like to put you in a hot seat a little bit. This is not just a U.S. issue. I know, obviously, the bulk of the protests have been in the United States, but up here in Canada, in Toronto, we've seen it, in London, across the globe. And Canopy is unique. They are a global entity, operates in over a dozen different countries globally. I mean, how are you guys looking at this from a global perspective?
Yeah, it's a really important issue for our company, Jason, and I appreciate the question, and I also appreciate all the remarks that Patrick made, because we do, as a small GR team, think about this all day, every day. And I'll get to that a bit more in a minute, but specifically to Canopy, we've put out a number of statements related to our position and standing with those demanding justice. So we are there. But we have decided that we need to take more time as a company to review what we're going to do, because this isn't about press releases, it's about acting. And Patrick mentioned the boardroom and the C-suite. So we're taking a close look internally with our leaders at our own diversity inclusion program, which we began working on last year, when Hillary Black stepped into the role as head of our corporate social responsibility. This is something that we have a number of ongoing conversations over the next few weeks. And we're excited to be showing the results and that path forward at some point in the near future. So hopefully next time when we chat, we'll be able to provide some more specifics about what we're doing internally. But externally, it's going to be really important for us as a company and others in the cannabis space to continue to partner with social justice organizations and programs across the U.S. Canopy's biggest, around the world, Jason, Canopy's biggest thrust has been with National Expungement Week, which we partnered last year there, and we will do so again this year. We're excited about that partnership. And also in Illinois, and also in New York, we have a partnership there that we've just established with the Last Prisoner Project to help cannabis prisoners for nonviolent offenses get out of jail. So this is just kind of tip of the iceberg of what we're doing. And again, I think when we chat in a month or two, we'll have a lot more discussion about what Canopy's up to, and we're excited about the project and to be a part of the movement.
That's great news and incredibly interesting. And I guess it really begs the question, and this is an open question, all of you maybe want to hear from Eric a little bit, but is this something that really, truly should be addressed through federal legalization? I mean, instead of just, going with the decriminalization route, is this what we really need legislation for to address?
Absolutely. We have to come to grips with the fact that our cannabis laws, our drug laws generally, particularly as it relates to cannabis, have a long history of racial bias and racial prejudice, going back to Harry Anslinger in the 1930s, the first Federal Bureau of Narcotics chief, who was an unrepentant, blatant racist. And the very use of the term marijuana with an H was they used that term rather than cannabis or other terminology so that they could make it sound more Mexican. So the entire history of the laws set up to enforce marijuana were designed in large part to put black and brown men into cages. When you look at how they've been enforced over the past, through Nixon and Schedule 1, all the way through, through recent attorneys general, black men are arrested at 4 times the rate than white men for cannabis, despite the fact that they're only 12% of the population, African Americans. So that is not an accident. That is systemic and it's systematic. And if we're going to look at this whole notion that probable cause is the color of your skin, well, what is the pretense for an arrest? The statistics are staggering on this. We spend $3.5 billion a year on cannabis enforcement alone. We do 600,000 arrests a year for cannabis. In 2016, we did 600,000. That is more than all violent crime arrests in America combined for all violent crime. Our priorities are out of whack, and you have to wonder, is this really about cannabis? Right? Or is this about something deeper? Somebody's arrested every 37 seconds, and 88% of arrests are for possession. So we have to grapple with that. We have to grapple with it as part of a larger package. We absolutely, decriminalization and legalization, the passage of the ability to access banking is a component of it. But social justice component is going to be critical. For so many African-American men, their interaction with police happens because of a suspicion of cannabis use. You can smell it in the air. If they're nearby, they're gonna arrest or at least question the nearest African-American male. So until we grapple with that, the mayor of Kansas City is just saying this week, we have got to decriminalize this for possession, or else we're never really going to get at this. This is step one, and it has to be part of a larger federal package.
It's absolutely mind-boggling, the numbers, the waste of time, resources, the effect on people's lives. As you pointed out, for generations. I mean, this is a 100-year-old plus problem, let alone all the other injustices and what have you. And that said, we are, if you look globally at what's happening with respect to cannabis, there's been a lot of progress. I mean, we have over 20 countries around the world that have legalized marijuana for medical use. Mexico's soon slated to join Canada on legalizing for adult use. We have the WHO that's recommended that cannabis be rescheduled. I believe the UN's voting on that shortly, and they usually always follow the WHO's recommendations. So we're interested to see what happens with that, because that will affect all the international treaties, which is a huge part of the problem. In the US, even, we've had at the federal level some progress. Obviously, we had GW Pharma with Epidiolex being approved to have a plant-based cannabinoid pharmaceutical used to treat childhood epilepsy. That was a big step in 2018. Going forward, after that, DA rescheduled CBD all the way down to Schedule 5. So we're seeing progress. David, you guys have obviously, being a global company headquartered in Canada, breaking into the US market, you obviously have a lot riding on what happens here at a federal level. What's your take? What's happening? What's the next steps at the federal level? What's your perspective there?
Yeah, good question, and a very good summary globally, Jason. I think first of all, the WHO recommendations to the UN are critically important. They've punted on the boat there a couple times now, but it is rescheduled for this coming December. So we're engaged with our US government here. I know other companies are as well. The US position is going to be really important on this. It's going to help drive a lot of the other nation states. So that's something we're watching closely and trying to make sure that our position as a country is a good one. On Capitol Hill, I think that the efforts there similarly will also drive efforts around the world. And there's just a couple, I think, important notes. So Eric and Patrick alluded earlier to COVID relief. And the primary point to make there is that we as an industry have not received any relief from COVID thus far. So if you think about the three prongs that I pressed for early on, the industry pressed for, it was the Safe Banking Act, it was access to small business loans, and it was standard business deductibility. So to date, we don't have any of that. Now, big thanks and hat tip to Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats for putting the Safe Banking Act into the HEROES package, which is now sitting in the Senate. We don't know the fate of it. We very much encourage Chairman Crapo and Leader McConnell to adopt the Safe Banking Act, because this is, of course, about access to banks, but it's a public health issue now. We've got to stop dealing in cash, especially that essentials are deemed essential, as we started with in this conversation. We've got to make sure that we're able to have access to the banks so we don't have to deal with cash day in and day out, because that's a problem. The second thing I'll say is that the COVID crisis, oddly enough, because we were all deemed essential, it's really created a great deal of momentum. And coupled with what Eric just said previously about criminal justice reform, we believe that cannabis legalization is going to be a part of that as well. So the momentum is strong at the moment. And I think the most talked about piece of legislation is the MORE Act, which Chairman Nadler from New York has introduced. And the most important piece of that legislation, aside for in parallel to descheduling, is the fact that it weaves the social justice that we were talking about earlier through the entire bill. It really, no portion of that bill exists without social justice. And, if I'm doing my day job correctly, both in Washington, D.C. and also in state capitals, I'm making sure that that component is weaved into any package that we're addressing. So there's been a lot of discussion about moving the MORE Act this year and also preparing for what things will look like next year.
Can you talk a little bit more about the tax piece and the regulatory components of the MORE Act and how it's going to, should come into play?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple things that the industry's been thinking about since the MORE Act was introduced last year. And first is the tax piece, which they set a flat federal excise tax rate, which is fine because we're going to need to generate federal excise tax from the sale of this product, just like they do with beverage alcohol. But we need to make sure that we are doing it in a way that allows for the legal market, or the illegal market rather, to transition into the legal market without an unusual tax burden. So there's been a lot of ideas that have floated around out there, but one of them is to start lower on the federal excise tax and then ramp it up to something that's comparable to alcohol once you get to the point where the illicit market has had the opportunity to transition.
And just quickly, what's happening at an industry level? Are we seeing collaboration? I mean, I know every company's focused on market share regionally, statewide, what have you. But I would have to think there needs to be a movement for everyone to get together and work as a united front. Are we starting to see that happen in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, we're getting a lot better. I'm a big fan of the trade association world, obviously spending a lot of time at one. I think they're very effective. If you looked at the beginning of COVID, you had the most sophisticated of the trade associations coming out right away with requests to Capitol Hill, to lawmakers, and also leaking them to the media for what exactly their industry needed to stay afloat, both short-term and long-term. And they were very successful. So we don't have that one voice yet in the industry, but at a minimum, I think that we need to begin discussions to make sure that we're prepared for 2021. Because this is really, in my mind, this is no longer a 3 to 5 year discussion about legalizing cannabis. It's a 1 to 3 year, and we need to make sure we're prepared in a unified way to present a unified message to Capitol Hill and in state capitals. Because if we don't do so, we're not going to be successful. I've been at this way too long. I've seen way too many industries coming at this from different directions and not being able to get done what they ultimately wanted to. So that's really a big challenge for us as a group, is to unify.
And I would just build on that a little bit by saying what's going on in the industry, despite the stories about COVID driving a spike in demand, is there is a capital crisis. All of the exuberant money that came in early through the angel rounds and friends and family is out there. There cannot be an injection of institutional investment in a meaningful way, or in a more meaningful way, without access to banking. So until that happens, you've got a $56 billion industry that is realizing 1/10 of its U.S. addressable market. So what does 10x look like, and how do we get there? Currently, you mentioned, Jason, the industry employs 250,000 people already. That's 4 times as many people as the coal industry. So this is an industry that is poised to explode, but they can't, because they can't get access to the capital markets in a real meaningful way. They can't hockey stick. And until we do, and this is not an industry that's looking for a handout. This is, with Just Cause, the airline industry got $50 billion out of CARES Act, the restaurant industry. People are looking for industry-specific changes. We're looking for the removal of obstacles. There are 4 or 5 obstacles that David just enumerated. The minute those are removed, the minute all that capital comes in, and this industry explodes, not just in big cities, not just in the coast, but in states and communities throughout the U.S., rural, small towns, and that's going to be the exciting moment. But until we get there, and absent a comprehensive federal plan, we are going to be stuck at the starting line.
Yeah, agreed. So, election coming up, obviously, on everyone's mind. Obviously, it's going to be interesting. I mean, we really have, 2 70-year-old baby boomer white guys that neither of which seem to be horribly supportive of cannabis. So I guess I'll put it that way. Patrick, is it going to matter who gets elected, right? Like, what's your view on that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and we often make the point that we work well with and want to work well with both parties, and we think this issue's a winner for whoever takes the mantle and wants to run with it, a political winner and a true public policy winner with the public. But the way you framed the question, I think, is exactly right. You have 2 candidates for personal, political, and I'm sure a whole host of other reasons that are not just quite there on the issue, and I think you see that a lot with politicians of a certain generation. What I would say in terms of how the election results will impact the cannabis movement in the United States is that I think it will impact it to some degree on timing, depending on who wins the election, but regardless of who wins the election, it will not slow down the forward progress. And I'll provide an example on sort of what I'm talking about. The gay marriage movement saw in this country a lot of peaks and valleys, and then a tremendous steam ahead in a really short period of time. And if President Trump is reelected, I could see something akin to the election of 2004 when President Bush was reelected. You had all these state ballot measures on defining marriages between a man and a woman. And after President Bush was reelected, I think there was real heartache within the LGBTQ community about what the prospects were for gay marriage going forward. But it turned out that in the course of time, it was only in the next term of the next president that we ended up, getting the historic Supreme Court ruling. So it didn't end up taking, I think, nearly as long as some people would have thought the day after the 2004 election. If Vice President Biden's elected, I think the prospects for seeing a legalization at the federal level, it's going to be much, much faster. I think there's still going to be an education and a phase-in period for sure, and I think there's going to be, there's going to need to be some patience at the very beginning. But I think you'll see it happen, within a first term of a Biden presidency. And just to take the gay marriage analogy even further, what I think all of us would love to see is whoever Vice President Biden picks as his running mate, I think that they should get right out in front of this issue the same way that Vice President Biden did on gay marriage with President Obama. And everyone sort of remembers he famously came out and said he was for it, and then that forced the White House to have to respond, the president to have to respond, and they were already moving that way anyway. But I would hope that whichever woman Vice President Biden picks does the same thing. And this will be, his running mate, just by definition of who he's considering, will be a woman who is more progressive on cannabis than he is, because every single woman he's considering supports legalization. And if it's a woman of color, they'll have dealt firsthand, both in their personal and professional lives, with issues of racial injustice. And so I think we're hoping as an industry that that person can be a real supportive voice within a Biden administration if he wins. The one area I would say that that example doesn't work, and it's a really important example, is that gay marriage was decided by a historic Supreme Court ruling. And all of us in the industry are not waiting for the US Supreme Court to decide the fate of legalization of cannabis in America. We want lawmakers to act. We want Congress and our president to work together to create an equitable law that sets up a fair system for how cannabis is regulated in the United States, and that addresses the social injustices that have taken place and provides opportunities for people within this industry.
So it's going to be
I would build on that as well. And Patrick put it well. He said, let's talk about the impact of the election on the legalization of cannabis movement. But I think the reverse is also true. Let's look at the impact of the legalization of cannabis movement on the election and the impact that it could have. Because when you look at the key demographics, like veterans, like millennials, like boomers, who nobody remembers is the Woodstock generation, when you go right up and down Republicans and Democrats, these are folks who can impact, and there are single issue voters out there. This is something that can move somebody's opinion of a candidate. And I think that's what is going to be incumbent upon the folks who are active in this movement, personally and at a corporate level, to get involved with the campaigns. And it's a perfect opportunity for either or both campaigns to pivot forward. And the one who does it first, David, I think, is going to be the one who gets the advantage on this.
Yeah, why don't we wrap it up with that last thought from David, and probably move on to Q&A. I think Joe is waiting. So David, do you see that? Do you see this becoming an issue that moves the needle with the different voting blocks?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think Eric alluded to it already, but we're talking about progressives. We're talking about single issue cannabis voters. We're talking about minority voters. All three of those categories are really important to the vice president and to the president. They're watching each very closely. And I think that the electability argument that our industry is going to make to both campaigns is really going to set up that jump ball that Patrick alluded to earlier. So you're going to have two almost octogenarians trying to swat the cannabis ball, and whoever ends up with it, I think, is going to have a massive advantage in this election.
It's going to be just, it's fantastic. I mean, the industry has been growing for a while, country by country, state by state. It's going to be really interesting. I know we have to deal with the pandemic. I know we have to deal, arguably more importantly, with the social, justice issues, reform issues, but, cannabis could be a large part of that. But I have to believe that as we go through the remainder of this year, we get through the election, we hear from the UN on whether they reschedule or not, as we continue to see legalization across the globe. There's a lot of tailwinds behind the cannabis movement. And it's every step of the way, it just makes it bigger, bigger, and bigger. There's a recreational component, there's a medical component, we're not even getting into the whole industrial aspects of it and how that could, help deal with issues like global warming, what have you. So it's going to be really fascinating to see how this industry grows, the job growth it brings, hopefully some of the reform it brings, and just where we'll be a few years from now. It'll be pretty exciting to see. Joe, maybe we should turn over to you to see if there's any Q&A that we can help out with.
Yeah, Jason, thanks a lot. This is John Darcy here, the Managing Director of SALT, jumping in to handle the audience Q&A, which we've got a lot of engagement from the audience. I want to thank all the panelists for such an engaging discussion. So the first question is, which specific states do you think are next to legalize or decriminalize cannabis? And what do you think the timeline is for that?
Patrick, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, two states that we've been following extremely closely are Pennsylvania and New York State. And, what I think we've seen across the country as states consider adult use programs is, there's some regional competition that takes place. And if one state sees a bordering state making a move, it is of the utmost importance that they act. I can speak, to the situation in the Midwest. There was, tremendous pressure on the state of Illinois to act through the legislative process because we knew it was on the ballot in Michigan. And we knew that there was a strong likelihood that it was going to pass in Michigan. And you want to make sure that, you are kind of the regional leader. We've seen what that's done for the cannabis industry in a state like Massachusetts, what it's done in California. And so I would look to Pennsylvania and New York. I think Pennsylvania is, David and Eric and all of our partners talk about this all the time, that it is just really ripe for something to happen there. And then New York has gotten so close so many times that I think that the combination of COVID and the economic, issues that states and localities are going to be facing, and the fact that you may have another regional player moving, is going to create, the strong likelihood that New York State will do something. And then I also think, to answer the question just another way, I think states that have not had anything before are going to be looking at entering and doing a medical program. And I would look to a state like North Carolina and others to potentially look at addressing something like that as well, which is all positive movement for us and for our industry.
As a North Carolina native, that's good to hear. How do you think the black market, gray market issue in a place like California, for example, will be solved with federal legalization?
Yeah, I'll talk to that a little bit. The start being up here in Canada, and we have federal legalization, and the problem, it's not a cure-all necessarily. It has to be done in a thoughtful way. And David, you can talk a lot more about this. Obviously, being a Canopy, you've seen what's happened up here. But I mean, pricing has to be right. You have to get broad-based distribution. You can't have the red tape. You can't have the hurdles. Here in Ontario, largest province in Canada, we have, people have been talking generally in the market that we haven't seen the sales that we thought we would. Well, 15 million people, and there was only 22 or 23 dispensaries available in the first year of legalization. I mean, that's ridiculous. There was no access to it. You were able to go on the Ontario Cannabis Store and order online. And that happened, legalization happened in the middle of a federal postal strike. So you could order, but you wouldn't get it. So, the laws have to be there, but the whole supply chain has to build out around it. And, everyone has to really get behind it to make sure that there is, a proper and effective rollout. David, do you want to touch on it a little bit?
I actually think that you hit all the high points. I mean, I was just jotting this down. It's transitioning the illegal market into the legal market. It's setting the tax rate correctly, both short and long term, and it's about the outlets. We hear about the outlets all the time. It's a huge problem. And I'd also just want to add into the question previously about the timing on some of these states. 2021 could be a massive year for the state-by-state legalization effort. And let's also not forget that if a state that is a red state legalizes in any way, shape, or form, that state then has direct influence on their senators and makes it even more difficult for them to oppose the efforts on Capitol Hill. So that's been the playbook all along. And I think an important point to add as we talk about the timing on states.
Great. Just to dive in more into presidential politics and the effect of the election potentially on marijuana legislation, cannabis legislation and regulation. We have a couple questions on that I'll group into. What do you think? You touched on the likelihood, if Vice President Biden wins, the increasing likelihood that we might see reform early in his presidency. But what do you think would happen in the event that a Republican administration wins? That would be a second term with Donald Trump. And if Republicans remain in power, do you think there's a movement within the Republican Party even to start legalizing and decriminalizing cannabis. What do you think would happen in that scenario?
Yeah.
I used to have a joke that libertarians were just Republicans who smoke pot. I think that's changed and morphed a little bit. I think it's inevitable either way. However, I think it's going to happen more quickly if Vice President Biden becomes president. My worry about a second Trump administration on this issue is that with, you look at his choices for attorneys general, first Jeff Sessions, who undid the Cole memo, and then Bill Barr, who has been vehemently opposed to legalization. If he were to continue as attorney general, I just think with those folks whispering in the president's ear and no then electoral upside to do anything about it, it might take a little more time.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Eric said. And I would add, I do not think it will slow the progress we see at the state level. And in fact, I think it could speed it up. I think if President Trump's reelected and his administration decides they just don't want to do anything federally on cannabis legalization, I think you'll see states continue to act and probably speed up their action because the public's there. And we've all talked about it for a variety of reasons, but the most important reason, and I think you see this with all social and economic change over the course of time, people who experience it in their day-to-day lives understand the benefits. And there's been a real education for a lot of people on what cannabis is and what it can provide to communities.
So speaking, you touched briefly earlier on the vice presidential pick and what effect that could have on cannabis regulation. And you mentioned some of the African-American women who are under consideration for that VP slot. Is there one candidate in particular that has a record and is on the record regarding cannabis regulation and legislation that you think would be the most favorable for early action in a Biden administration?
I think that Senator Kamala Harris is still top of my list in terms of the president's VP shortlist. She has a very strong position on legalization. She was an author of the MORE Act companion. So she's already there. She understands the the social justice pieces that I referenced earlier. And I really think that she could lead on this issue if the president chooses not to. And again, we're going to make the electability case to former Vice President Biden's campaign. I don't know whether they will side with it or not, but I do think it's something that Senator Harris could lead on if she was the pick. But we've done an analysis of everybody that's on that short list, and they almost all, without exception, have positions that they've already taken that are pro-legalization.
Anybody want to add to that?
No, I think David hit it right on the head. And I would just say, if all of the candidates on the short list support legalization, which they do, the question then becomes about who is going to want to lead on the issue and who is going to take that position that will in some ways run a little bit contrary to the position that Vice President Biden has laid out, and who is going to be willing to build political support within the White House, in Congress, and using the personal relationship that they're going to have with the president to move him on that issue. That's really what I'm looking for. And I think David said it just right with Senator Harris. She's already shown, in her presidential campaign that she's willing to come out and show separation between her and the vice president on an issue that was important to her. And I think she's shown just this week in this debate on criminal justice reform that she's willing to make a strong, assertive case on something that she's passionate and believes in. I'm sure all the women on the short list would. But I think, we've had a chance to, all of us, work with her in her time in the Senate and in California, and I think she'd be a tremendous advocate. But we would really view this for any of the women who are under consideration, if they're chosen, as a huge, huge opportunity to lead on an issue. And when you're vice president, that job, it doesn't have a huge job description. The people who really become successful as vice president, like Vice President Biden was, take on certain issues and lead on them. And this would be, I think, a really important one for whichever woman is chosen to do so.
Imagine two scenarios: a conversation about legalization with Vice President Kamala Harris, or a conversation about legalization with Vice President Mike Pence, and how divergent those might be. And you can never underestimate the power of the cabinet. You know, people like Eric Garcetti, people like, you know, all the people who ran for president, a number of those are going to be in the Biden administration as cabinet secretaries. So they're going to have a role to play and a voice on this. And there's going to be a chorus of yes voices for legalization.
Great point. So going back to Attorney General Barr, we have a question about whether you think his alleged targeting of cannabis companies for antitrust review has affected M&A in the industry. You know, there was a whistleblower that said today that 10 deals were targeted just because Barr doesn't like cannabis and doesn't like the industry. And has that put a damper on deals and deal making at a time when the person who's asking the question believes that consolidation in the industry is needed? And what effect has that had on stock prices in the space?
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to have an issue with stock prices in the space, and until we get a full, proper federal regime and even a global regime, and just even globally, the U.S. is a catalyst. Just think of the international tax treaties, drug treaties, every aspect of how we do global commerce. Until we get the world's largest economy on board, it's going to be really hard to scale this entire industry. And right now, it's really fragmented and broken up. I mean, it's even if with everything being perfect, it's going to take time to build up supply chains, obviously, to go from narrative to pure execution. There's no question about that. But when you have the world's largest economy sitting there, really taking a fragmented approach to it, not knowing what's right, we can look at hemp, CBD-derived hemp, technically federally legal, but we don't even have FDA guidance on how we can sell it, right? You look at what's happening in Kentucky right now, obviously, and they clearly want the legalization of hemp to support their economy. And they have businesses going bankrupt all the time because we can't get a coherent framework to allow anyone to succeed. So, you know, I just feel that we're going to continue to see a lot of volatility in the market until we start to see movement on a global scale, particularly in the US, but also on a global scale. I'm hoping that, you know, the UN moves forward, votes to reschedule, post-election, we start to see state by state, obviously, a lot of states coming online, but most importantly, federal legalization. Again, it's going to fill a lot of holes. I think we've heard that consistently, a bunch of the holes that can fill. Once that starts to happen, I think we'll see this evolve as a normal, you know, profitable industry. Until then, it's going to be lumpy, it's going to be volatile.
So we have two more questions and then we'll wrap up. Thanks for all the audience engagement to all the viewers. Do you think a single buyer, one buyer system is the way to go to make sure that retailers can't compete with illicit dealers?
I don't know. I'd have to ponder that question. That's actually not something that we've been really thinking about in terms of the federal regulatory structure that I referenced earlier. But certainly something that I, you know, happily take back to the drawing board with my other industry partners and those on the Hill. Patrick, Eric, any thoughts from the two of you?
I think that sort of government mandated market control is never a good idea. I think the free market with budget for enforcement and with a logical tax scheme, which lowers the price of legitimate cannabis to the point or lower than that in the black and gray market, that's how you get there. You know, if the goal is right, driving down or driving out black market competition, I think you could do that through other measures without these overarching market controls. I start to worry when you have sort of a single entity controlling any distribution point.
All right, so last question is, how long do you think it will be and what do you think the impetus will be for pension fund trustees and institutional investors in general to regard investment in the cannabis industry as a normal course of business?
You know, my opinion on it, I'll pass it on to the rest. You know, looking at, you know, when we're out speaking with originally raising capital several years ago when we started in this space, all the big pension funds, insurance companies, larger asset managers, you know, your typical go-to institutions for raising capital just didn't want to get involved in a space because they didn't, yes, there was a fear of the illegality. I think they all feel it's going to move beyond that. But what the catalysts are really waiting for is that proper, regulatory framework, so that they could actually properly value the companies they're investing in, know that they could execute. I mean, right now, it's really hard to put together a business plan when you don't know how to roll out, when you don't know what the tax consequences are going to be, when you have, employee safety issues, what have you. So it's when you can't get, for example, COVID relief that we've seen in certain examples. So I think until we see a proper framework, or at least a lot of positive movement towards that, where we know what's going to happen, I think that's when you're going to start seeing large institutional investment come in, where they can properly evaluate the business plan, look at the competitive landscape, and understand how it's all going to fit together. Until then, it's a little bit too ad hoc to make a proper investment analysis, I think, for them.
Thank you all. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, David, for joining us today. This was a fascinating discussion on an industry that's very fast growing, and I think only has the potential to accelerate further once we get a little bit more clarity, maybe starting in November, about regulation in the space. This episode is going to be posted on demand afterwards. So if you tuned in live and you want to go back and listen to some of the clips, we'll post it on the SALT YouTube channel, and pass it around to your friends who might be interested in the space, because I think increasing awareness about what's going on in the cannabis space is very important for a variety of reasons, including social reasons. We're seeing a lot of obviously activism today, and I think addressing some of these issues related to cannabis regulation will help solve some of those issues, especially as it relates to criminal justice reform.